Hello everybody and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hoping well, today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw the new film Wonka come out to a strong start for what the early indications were. As far as the early tracking was not looking very good. However, the film has definitely rebounded quite a bit since then and is poised, and this is not just me, but now many other people are also mentioning this as well, both in the so-called professional industry and also on the YouTube space, that we suspect this film, Wonka, probably will have a better than expected run during the holiday season. It just seems to have a lot of the hallmarks of a movie that would tend to do well, especially since a lot of the ratings for this movie have not been terrible. Right? I would say most of the reviews, in fact, including for people in the space with a part of the fellowship and other, kind of fellowship adjacent places, we've seen most people have either been very middle of the road with the movie to even possibly liking it a little bit. I have definitely heard some negative things about the film also. I think a lot of that's going to stem just from the fact that Timothée Chalamet is just not going to be what a lot of people expect to play the titular character of Willy Wonka in this prequel movie. That all being said, I do think still that the numbers will probably speak for themselves, and this is going to be a very difficult film to track because it did get an early release internationally, whereas a lot of other releases tend to get pretty much their entire release in their opening weekend, both domestic and international. But in the case of this film, because of that early release, I'm not going to be able to do my typical tracking on it. But right now, it is looking pretty good. And of course, we will continue to track where this film stands in relationship to its overall budget. All of this while we have other films to talk about, including Hunger Games continuing to also perform well, especially domestically after 5 weeks of release. The Boy and the Heron also sticking around, though even though it's adding more theaters, it's also seeing quite a precipitous drop-off. And Godzilla Minus One continuing also to add more screens and continuing to hold quite strong in comparison to what is being added on as well, all the while films like Wish and others still are inevitable flops. Not only that, we also today are going to talk further about why Disney is in a very, very bad position for the year, because I've got the numbers, I've got the data, and even though we could argue that the numbers are not fully complete yet because there are some budgets that are probably a lot higher than what is being reported, and also marketing budgets are not always the same for these various releases, in either case, it still looks really, really bad, and right now I'm saying, yeah, Disney has lost over $1 billion this year in just their theatrical releases, and we'll talk further about that. We've already talked about a little bit on a previous live stream, but I did want to bring up the worst case scenario numbers for this movie because I talked about this, and I mentioned how there is a chaotic insanity chart, is what I describe it, where you take into account every single market. So take into account international cut, the cut that you get from China if you have money in China. I did all of that math. Drove me a little nuts doing it, but let's just say it doesn't make too much of a difference, but enough of a difference nonetheless, where it just means massive losses, close to $1.5 plus billion, in fact, in losses for Disney just in the year 2023. And just based off of theatrical with the numbers we currently have available. Before we go further, please make sure you smash that like button, light up that fire button, and Ozzy, smash the rumble button as well. And also make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification. That way you know every time your video or live stream is live on the channel. So as you can see, the number one film this weekend domestically, of course, was the new Warner Brothers film Wonka. It is a prequel to the story of Willy Wonka, where he got his start before things happened. I initially was going to be seeing this movie, decided instead, you know what, it's not really on the top of my list, even though this is from, I think, a similar group that took care of the Paddington films, which were actually a lot better than I had expected them to be. I just did not really have a huge drive to go see this movie. So it's still on my to-watch list. It's still on a list of things that I might want to see at some point, maybe, just to maybe understand how does this actually compare. Nothing's ever going to come close to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Nothing is ever performance-wise going to be able to compare to the performance from Gene Wilder. Even though I don't have any issue with Timothée Chalamet. I know that a lot of other people might have issues with him, especially in this role. Ultimately, I'd be willing to give it a fair chance just to see what it is like. But doesn't really matter what I think, because this film is still right now the strongest performer at the box office. As you look at these numbers here, right, $9,000 per theater, $39 million in the domestic market. If we go to talking first about Tony, good old Tony, over at Deadline. He says, Wonka is yummy. Oh, goodness. So Tony is just the king of puns, especially in his headlines. He's obsessed. Think that he spends more time on his headlines than he does on anything else. But it's also just very weird to use that. I understand why, obviously because Willy Wonka, chocolate, all that stuff. But calling Wonka yummy, to me, it just doesn't come across as effective as you think it might, Tony. In fact, it comes across a little bit weird. It goes on to say, Wonka had a very strong hold on Saturday with $14 million, just 3% off of its Friday-Thursday previews of $14.4 million, leading to an estimated $39 million, which is slightly north of the $35.3 million start that Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse did back in the same mid-December slot in 2018. Now, full stop. Tony, of course, is never going to adjust for inflation or at the very least bring up how different ticket prices were even back in 2018. And so even though this film definitely did better than the raw numbers of Into the Spider-Verse, we know that Spider-Verse did better. Just on paper did better, sold more tickets, and especially with how much the rate of inflation has impacted not just the total value of the dollar, but also what we've seen as far as the actual change in the prices of tickets as well, it's very unfair to even make the comparison. For family movies opening at this point in time, it's a marathon, not a sprint, and there's a lot of road left for Wonka, especially with 21% of K through 12, 76% colleges off tomorrow per ComScore. We are still in school ourselves, but we obviously are getting off this week, rising to 66 and 93% by Friday, and finally 100% out all next week. And this is one of the many reasons why you do tend to see some movies, not all, but some movies do a lot better in those daily numbers, right? In the stretch, as far as the legs of the movie itself. We saw this happen a little bit last year. For instance, we had Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, which did not have the best opening weekend ever. It wasn't really all that impressive, but because the film was able to leg out, and I think a big part of that was actually because the film was actually good, right, in comparison to a lot of the other schlock that comes out of these major studios these days. That was definitely, towards the higher end of the scale as far as quality is concerned, and definitely a film that I think a lot of people were very, very big fans of, and their kids enjoyed, and it wasn't really offensive. It wasn't something they had to worry about bringing their kids to, as in the case with many Disney films. But with that being said, it was still able to do that, mostly because it was a film that got some pretty positive praise. Wonka, I just don't think is getting the same level of praise as that movie did. I very well could just be off on that one. I've not really had my finger on the pulse of this movie because it really is just not a film I have that much interest in. But I will say, I think ultimately this film probably will be one of those movies that does have those kinds of holds. Now, not all movies are impacted by that. That's an important factor that sometimes these people don't mention, right? They try to bring up the examples like a Puss in Boots: Last Wish or other films that had very strong legs down the stretch. For the case of a movie like Wish, for instance, they would probably bring up, well, Elemental earlier this year had a lower, box office opening than what historically would have been impressive, but it legged out. But that was more so kind of fool's gold because most of that money came from those international markets, not really from holds domestically or from the opening weekend markets either. And so even though we are definitely seeing at least a somewhat similar release schedule in the case of what we have with Wish, as far as it getting late, international releases, it has a much smaller footprint domestically, and it's just not holding really anywhere. He goes on to say, per box office analytics firm Intelligence, Wonka's opening weekend translates to 3 million admissions, or 49% of the entire marketplace's foot traffic. So again, that to me, I don't know what it typically would be, but if half the people going to the movies are seeing Wonka, and it's the opening weekend, and there's no other major films that have come out, I don't know. That sounds kind of off to me, especially for a film that's, again, Tony and others are acting as if it is just the greatest performing film, or just so, it's sweet, as he says. It's yummy, as Tony says. And again, I think context is always a very key thing. Worldwide weekend for Wonka is bigger than expected at 92.6 million, including debuts in France, Belgium, Holland, Australia, New Zealand, Italy, Denmark, Sweden, and Poland. The Paul King directed movie running global total is 151 million. The Helmer's top two titles currently are Paddington and Paddington 2. So as you can see, the director of the film was also the director of the Paddington film, so that's like the strong connection that you have there, and that's why I do think this film is probably tracking towards getting to that $200 to $300 million number worldwide by the end of its run, and if the number holds very strongly, we could see it do even better than that. based off of the numbers right now, well, again, I'm not seeing it upwards of 400 million at this point, but don't be surprised if some of the numbers, and we'll see, of course, if the numbers do indeed hold, right? This week's numbers, I think, will be a big indicator of that. But if it does start to hold, expect it to do a lot better. Nancy, good old Nance, also over at Deadline, is talking about how Wonka is sweetening the pot to $150 million global opening amid expanded rollout, and mentioning also the fact that Songbirds and Snakes has gotten to $300 million worldwide, which is still a good, $200 to $300 million less than the last lowest grossing film in the Hunger Games franchise. Again, individually, it's doing fine. It's making money. It's making profit. No one can deny that, but still hard to justify reigniting a franchise when it is by far the lowest money maker. In a total of 77 markets overseas, the Paul King-directed movie, Timothée Chalamet starring, at another $53.6 million to its second weekend session. So again, this film has been out now for 2 weeks in many international markets, and that's why it's a lot harder for me to track this, whereas usually if you have the actual, the day and date release for both domestic and international, normally I can find that. One thing I did want to mention, the only reason why I'm even bringing up Nance in the first place is because I saw this, I posted this on Twitter, on X earlier, and I just find this to be hilarious. It says, elsewhere, Disney's Wish is gaining some traction with a supposedly solid 38% hold internationally, and including a number one spot opening in Japan this weekend of $4.4 million. Now, to kind of translate that, it had a 38% hold, not because it was holding in all these markets so well, but because it's releasing, as they've just said, because it's just released in another market. Right? So because it's now getting the first weekend numbers for certain countries that have not reported yet, of course its hold's going to be stronger because that's new money that has not been accounted for. So that number, mentioning that, I think is a bit disingenuous for one, but also two, if you just look at these numbers, right? 4.4, by the way, interestingly enough, the number one opening in Japan this weekend at $4.4 million. The full frame was worth $12.2 million from 39 markets. So again, a 38% drop, but look at what percentage that Japan made up of that. So that's why this number right here is crap. There's really no reason to even bring that up. And this is just the kind of spin that you typically find from a lot of these Hollywood types. And that's why I like to call out people like Nance and Tony over at Deadline. Let's go ahead and go into the numbers at thenumbers.com, of course, talking about domestic. So Wonka, clearly the number one movie this weekend, $39 million there. Very, very impressive, $9,000 per screen. And I say impressive, not because in and of itself it's impressive, but because this movie was tracking in like the 20s, right? We're talking about a film that really up until maybe a week or two ago was tracking in the 20s to low 30s. So the fact that it's gotten now to around $39 million domestic in its projections is definitely a good sign. You always want to be trending upward when it comes to the box office, and especially when you're entering into this holiday frame. We have this last week before the actual direct Christmas holiday, and of course then the 12 days of Christmas after the fact. So you have all of these people that are going to be off from schools, especially the younger audiences that are going to be the key demographic for what Wonka is trying to get at. It's also a movie that does not have to worry about it being associated with Disney, of all places. Not that Warner Brothers is all that better, but Disney is clearly a lot more toxic when it comes to, family audiences, because no one is showing up to see their movies, especially families nowadays. Wish is a prime example of that very fact. So right now, that's why the film is indeed on paper doing well for what it is. Still has a ways to go, but it's definitely off to a better start than what had been initially anticipated. The number 2 spot is once again Hunger Games. So this movie, out for 5 weeks, has been either the number 1 or 2 spot pretty much every single week that it has been out. So this film has not been performing as well as a film like maybe Godzilla Minus One has over the days of the week. But on the weekends, absolutely, Hunger Games has definitely taken over. As you can see, at $5.8 million, it did edge out The Boy and the Heron's second weekend of release by about $700,000 or so. These numbers, of course, could eventually adjust. But one thing to note is that losing 374 theaters, again, a smaller percentage drop. So very impressive to see that kind of drop there. Whereas The Boy and the Heron, adding 120 screens, losing and dropping 60%, this film is indeed right now kind of performing like many other anime films have. Very strong opening weekend because a lot of the big fans, especially this movie being a Miyazaki film, right? You have a lot of hardcore fans going out to see this film in droves, but it doesn't really have a lot of staying power. It's not a film that people will tend to see down the line. Normally it's a film you're either going to see or you're not going to see, and very little chances or very little times you see people kind of get influenced after the fact, at least in the domestic market where animes aren't nearly as popular as in other parts of the world, especially in markets like Japan. But still, Boy and the Heron doing well for a domestic anime release. Godzilla Minus One is also doing very well, and even more impressively, again, not just because of the raw numbers, but more so because it's now been out for 3 weeks. They initially had only really thought a week at a time, and so Initially, they had the week's worth of schedule, a week's worth of showtimes. Eventually, they realized, okay, we can obviously book more, and we got 2 weeks now going into our third weekend. So it's very awesome to see Godzilla Minus One getting this kind of treatment, and by the fact that it's adding more theaters, but it's still having some decent holds, right? A 43% hold in week 3. After another, previous strong hold is already impressive. But when you're adding more screens, that means that you're reducing your per theater ratio. So ultimately, the fact that it is essentially doing about as well with more theaters to account for is definitely a good sign for it. And I think that it has a lot of potential to do even better down the stretch, especially as we enter into this holiday season as well. I think that will be a film that probably does a lot better than what many had anticipated, because I think there might be some who have been kind of holding off on the film to see if it'll still be out when it gets to the actual holiday season, and then be able to hopefully see a version of the movie where they'll have the actual time to sit down and be ready to read those subtitles. I think that's still the biggest handicap against the movie, because there are just so many, especially in North America, audience people that just don't want to have to read subtitles in their movie. But still, doing very well for a great film, and a film that deserves the praise that it's getting. Trolls Band Together at number 5 is also still holding. This looks like to be another movie that will probably do kind of similar numbers throughout the holiday frame. The Wish film, $3.2 million after losing 310 screens after 4 weeks of release. Again, this film is definitely on the way out. It might stick around a little bit longer because of the holiday season, but this movie is pretty much all said and done at this point. Number 7 spot goes to Christmas with The Chosen. Fathom Events, 2,000 screens. So again, a decent per theater ratio there, but we've definitely seen stronger performances from them, even with those Fathom Events. Napoleon at from Sony Pictures, $2.2 million after 4 weeks, dropping from quite a number of screens, 749 to be, in fact, still a massive flop from Sony. Renaissance, a film by Beyonce, a film that most people still have not seen. Glad to see that happen. Poor Things from Searchlight is also still very, very limited in its release. It also just looks like an atrocious movie that is all about degeneracy, and just not the kind of movie that I think I would ever want to see. But with that being the case, we look at this movie and think to ourselves, okay, some people apparently are liking it, $15,000 per screen. So one of the best per theater ratios that you're going to see on here, but still. I did want to mention The Shift, because I know some people are caring about how that film is tracking. It's losing 800 screens this weekend, and so because of that, it is definitely looking like it's on the way out. So not going to be a big profit-turning movie as was the case with what we saw with Sound of Freedom. So I think that the Angel Studios group, again, whether or not this is actually going to be at their bottom line a financial loss, because usually a smaller studio is going to have very different financial requirements and also different financial spends. It's still, I think, a situation where they would rather have made more money than the $10.6 million domestic they've made so far. I think that they were probably expecting this film to get a little bit more money, especially because of the fact that it's from that same studio that distributed Sound of Freedom. They thought maybe that would have a bigger impact. Animal, also just want to mention that quickly, because that is the Bollywood movie that is also doing pretty well in the limited number of screens that it is currently in. Looking at the worldwide numbers, we got Wonka at $151.4 million. So as I had mentioned, it had made already about $50 million or so in the international market in its opening weekend. And so if you wanted to try to, do some reverse math on that one, we could argue that it got a $90 million opening weekend. If you take the first weekend of the international markets it was in, and then just add the domestic markets. The trick to that is that there's some markets that would have opened up in this weekend outside the United States, and so that's why it's almost impossible to track in that way. Either way, though, I think it is definitely doing better than expected. Hunger Games, $290 million is what's being reported by thenumbers.com, and so I think that what we'll see is that as these numbers continue to update, it'll get closer to that $300 million mark that was being mentioned by Nance. Of course, she could also have just been speaking in hyperbolic terms that it's getting close to that. Let's see if it says Sings past $300 million worldwide. So maybe these numbers have not been fully updated. Either way, though, again, better than expected. Still far off the mark as far as other Hunger Games films are concerned. Right now, $57 million worldwide is what we're seeing from Godzilla Minus One, according to the numbers as a recording of this video. I do think that this film has a decent chance of being able to possibly through the holiday season edge up close to $50 million domestic. Maybe we see this film even get to $100 million worldwide for a $15 million budgeted movie. That is very impressive. Trolls Band Together, $183. Again, the movie's performing okay. I don't think it's as big as they had hoped. We'll see if the holiday season helps them whatsoever. The Wish film is just not really doing anything. This film, right now, already crapping out at $54 million, so the chances of this getting to $100 million domestic are pretty much non-existent. Internationally, because it does have that delayed release, there is a chance that the film gets to $100 million internationally, but even that's the case, you're talking about a movie capping out, between $160 and $200 million, maybe? by the end of its run because of its delayed release. And when you have another film this year that had a delayed release in Elemental getting upwards of $350-400 million, it's definitely not a similar scenario there. Chris with The Chosen, not much to say there just because it is a very unique release. Napoleon at 188. Remember, this film cost $200 million, so that is not a good place for it to be. Renaissance at $36 million, even if you just estimate what the film cost. And there are some that actually speculate because she's actually had a previous movie that cost quite a bit more than what even someone like Taylor Swift would spend on the concert that she put on as far as the filming is concerned. Yeah, this is not good. So I'm glad to see it. I'm glad to see that this kind of movie is failing, but yeah, again, I do have to point out that we just don't know the actual numbers for that movie. Poor Things, as I mentioned, it's a modern take on the Frankenstein story from what I'm gathering, and it just features a lot of really creepy imagery. Basically, she has the mind of a child and then is engaging in relations with other men. And I think to myself, okay, yeah, that's just darn creepy. All right, that is just a creepy concept. And the fact that someone thought about that and then put it to film, I think that they have to be pretty creepy too. The Shift, $10.6 million. Again, not really all that impressive there. Going to the charts because we love doing charts here over at OMB Reviews. Let's go ahead and see if we can increase this chart a little bit. So first things first, let's talk about Wonka. So right now, the estimated budget is around $125 million. So that means that the total break even most likely will be somewhere around $312 million. And again, that is using a 2.5 times multiplier. For those that maybe use a 3 times number, this would be the break even point, 375. I do think that there's a possibility for it to get to either 1, in fact, right? 312, I think, is definitely within the possibilities for what the film is doing right now. But $96 million in the red, it still has a ways to go at this point in time. So we will, of course, be following that. With those numbers in, right, with that reported budget, right now it's around 1.2 times the budget. So it is what it is. Boy and the Heron right now at $99 million worldwide, so getting close to $100 million. $37 million in the red. So this movie, I think, also has that potential to kind of, over the course of its release, if it gets released in other countries especially, has the chance to maybe make some money back. But because we don't know officially what the actual cost of this movie was, again, I talked about this last weekend about how some are speculating it to be the most expensive film in their history, and that would put it close to around $65 million, if that is indeed the case. So once we get an official word on that, we'll have a better idea, but it's definitely not performing as strongly compared to what they spent on the movie, especially in comparison to other less expensive, not just Studio Ghibli films, but also Miyazaki films too. The film Renaissance at $57 million, the film Godzilla, I should say, at $57.2 million, based off of the budget of $15 million. Right now it's around $11 million in raw profits, 3.8 times its budget. I do think that it's going to continue to add to that. So if this film does somehow get to that $100 million worldwide number, that would be a very impressive, again, times its budget. And I think that this is definitely a good situation for them and a good situation for Toho as well. Talking about the Renaissance film now, it's around $8 million in the red. Oof, this is bad. So as I mentioned, historically, most films will make around 50 to 70% of their entire box office in their first 2 weeks. Right now, Renaissance by Beyonce is at 92%. So that means 92% of all the box office it's made so far was made in the first 2 weeks of its release. And if you go further than that, a huge portion of that was just in its opening weekend. So this movie definitely not seeing similar numbers to what the Taylor Swift movie found, which was a chart breaker in the... actually performed like a normal film did, Taylor Swift. Whereas so this movie is not performing at all like a normal film and is actually looking like it could even lose some money depending on how much they actually spent on it. The Shift at $3 million of losses, as I said, it's cost enough where it has still that chance to break even, but when you're losing 800 plus screens or so now into your third or fourth week of release, especially going into the holiday season, that's less opportunities for people to see it. So I think that film might end up being a financial loss, at least on paper. They probably didn't spend as much on marketing for that movie, and so one could definitely argue that point that they probably have maybe made some money or might at the very least break even, but definitely a far cry from what we saw with The Sound of Freedom. Napoleon at $188 million right now is $186 million in the red, so definitely not performing as well as they had hoped. The film Wish right now at $224 million in the red. This film, again, performing pretty much like a normal, again, historically normal film, and it will probably continue to drop in that overall percentage because it's going to perform better down the stretch with those international markets. But even if it does perform well, we're still talking about a movie that's going to be a far cry from what it needs to actually break even. That's just on the reported budgets, and that's using a typical right? 60% cut for the actual theater. We'll talk about, sorry, a 60% cut for the studio. We'll talk about what these numbers might actually look like if you take into account some other factors in the insane Disney chart that I talked about at the very beginning of this video. So if you've been waiting on that one, that is coming up in just a second. So Trolls band together, 32 million in the red. As I said, the holiday season might be able to help cut into that, but right now, not looking great for that movie. Thanksgiving continuing to add to its profits. Hunger Games, Battle of Songbirds and Snakes. As I said, right, it's looking good on paper, but even if you look at those budgets, or rather if you look at those profits, $25 million, looking at this film maybe ending somewhere between 50 and 75 million in net game profits. One could argue that because of their financing, they probably will have made closer to 100 million. It's still going to be a far cry from the other Hunger Games movies, though, so not really a whole lot to justify paying for future releases, right? Remember that just because a film is successful in its own right does not necessarily mean that the film is a huge hit or a huge success. Because if you don't even make enough money to, if you only make enough money to pay back the budget that you made, right, to essentially to make another movie for the same budget, but you're not able to even get close to the budget and the marketing costs or anything like that. The example I like to give is the Super Mario Bros. Movie, right? That movie made close to 600 plus million in net gain profit. And so if you look at that film's release, you think, okay, that film paid for its budget essentially 6 times over. And that means you can pay for another 3 to 4 movies, roughly, as far as, not just the actual budget, but also the marketing budget on top of that. A film like this really isn't going to pay its way going forward. And so that's why, as I said, it's not really not as impressive as what has been, previously pointed out by others on Deadline and things like that. The Marvel's at $199. I know Jeremy's happy about that one. $199. So it's still $210 million in the red. And so, yeah, this film has been abandoned by Disney, and for good reason, because the film is just not looking great. All right, let's go ahead and go into this insanity chart. So first off, actually, before we get to that, going into the Disney chart. So again, we love doing charts here. What I already had done was this. And so I took the bare minimum for budgets, right? The bare minimum for budgets as far as what has been actually reported. In fact, I think the only film I need to, actually, no, I think I already updated that one. Yeah, so again, I know that, for instance, Indiana Jones probably costs closer to $400 million, right? I already know that that is likely going to be the case. I know that the Marvels probably have also cost closer to $300 million. So this is just going based off of the reported budgets. Even if you were to take that, and you were to take my much more conservative studios get 60% of the entire box office, that means you're still looking at overall $828 million in financial losses for Disney this year, with only one movie for them having made conceivably any profit, being Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Now, as I said, this is using those reported budgets. This is also using a 60% cut for the actual studio and a typical marketing cost of 1.5 times the budget. Now, let's say that it's a bit worse for Disney, all right? Let's say that maybe if you look at the numbers, that you're looking instead at a movie that actually ended up costing a bit more. So if you look at the budget estimates, right, we're still using those reported budgets, but now we're talking just if you only take a 50% cut, right, across the board, studio gets 50%, theaters get 50%. If you take that into account, let me just go ahead and make sure also that I am not adjusting any of the other marketing budgets. No, I am not. When you look at that, you go all the way up to $1.2 billion in financial losses. So again, already, if that is going to be the metric that you want to use and the metric that maybe you have an issue with me on, guess what? We're talking now of a losses between $850 million to $1.2 billion. Now, some might still not be happy with this and say, well, wait a minute. We already know that it can't possibly be this amount because we know that China makes up for a certain amount. We know that international numbers have a much lower cut given to the actual studios. And so I decided to create what I'm calling the insanity chart. And so this is using a few different things, right? So for one, when we look at the actual budgets, right now I'm still just using those reported budgets, or I'm mostly using those reported budgets. I think Little Mermaid was reportedly 250 or so. But regardless of any of that, we're still using mostly those same numbers. But here is what the fun begins, all right? So domestic. Some argue that domestic is really about a 55% cut for the studio, right? Some say somewhere between 50 and 55% for the actual studio when it comes to what it makes domestically. So if it makes $100 million domestically, roughly half or a little more than half goes to the studio. The other half goes to the actual theaters themselves. And so I've broken that and I've gotten that number specifically, right? So just the domestic number. And then I mentioned here is the kind of cut you're going to see in the end totals. Internationally, usually see about a 40% cut for the studio on average, not including China. So 40% internationally, tends to be given to the studios. 60% tends to be given to the actual theaters or to the countries or whatever it might be. And so that is taken into account with the international numbers without China. And then we just have a category for China because China, as I said, takes 75% of the box office, leaving only 25% for the actual studio. And so here are the individual China numbers, and these were all as of the other day. When you take this into account, you go all the way, right, from $1.2 billion in losses to $1.4 billion. And again, this is using the metric here of individual 0.55, right, 55% domestic cut, 40% international cut, and a 25% China cut. And so these are the kinds of numbers that you see. So going back to what I mentioned before about Wish, that makes the film actually closer to around $250 million in financial losses. And again, that is based off of the total cost of the movie being $200 million budget, $300 million marketing. Some would say that the marketing for movies like Wish and others are probably a lot higher. And that's why I'm mentioning that to say, right now, the best case scenario for Disney is $800+ million in financial losses just from their theatrical releases alone. Right? That's the most conservative estimate. So the best argument you can make is that they lost close to $1 billion, when in reality, you're looking at probably somewhere closer to 1.2. So I'd have to guess $1.8+ billion in financial losses, especially as we get closer to finding out more about what the actual budgets for these movies were, and actually even update these further to have any reported marketing budgets on top of that. Oh boy, danger, danger, danger. And also, when you take into account all of these other factors, guess what? You also have to look at this right here to say $3.9 million in profit was what Guardians of the Galaxy made. So even then, the only profitable movie they actually have is still Guardians, and it's barely profitable. So basically, the news of Disney for this past year is this. None of their movies made money, and the only one that conceivably made any money barely made any and hardly made enough to, pay for any other projects going forward. And when you're spending, right, $3 billion or so in a given year on all of your movies with your marketing budgets, and Lord knows it's a lot higher than that, right, with your actual production budgets of close to $2 billion and the actual budgets reported there, $1.4 billion in financial losses. How do you possibly recover from that? And also, how do you possibly explain that away? So if you want to share this out, if you want to clip this part of the video out especially, Disney lost over $1 billion this year. These are just a few of the metrics there. And again, these aren't even the final numbers. We're probably going to see these films be a lot higher because even though you could argue, well, Wish is still making some money and the Marvels is still making some money, the amount of money that's going to be added on top with higher budgets that are actually going to be there versus what's being reported, and also higher marketing costs versus what is typically spent, means we're still looking at probably 1.5+ billion in losses, depending on how, of course, you adjust for inflation, not for just inflation, how you adjust for the cuts that a film and a theater get, a studio and a theater get in the different markets. But those are the numbers as they stand. Let me know your thoughts about any of these things in the comment section down below. Also, have you seen, let me pull out the breakdown again, have you seen the film Wonka? Was it any good? Was it worth your time? Let me know if you want further breakdowns using a similar metric. I don't know if I could mentally handle it, but let me know that also if you want to see the insanity chart for some other films or for some other franchises as I continue to do charting here throughout the end of the year. And I'll try to get some of these charts other than Disney also ready, see what were the biggest box office losers and winners of this year, looking at it just strictly from an actual studio perspective, though I think right now we can absolutely say Disney by far is going to be the winner, the biggest winner, biggest loser with the biggest financial losses. So let me know your thoughts about that as well. You guys are all amazing. Make sure you smash that like button, light up that fire button, and honestly smash the rumble button as well. And again, please share this out with your friends, anyone that you think that might find this informative or entertaining. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day, a blessed third Sunday of Advent. And as always, God bless. And now for a special shout out to all of my Chosen of Valhalla members for the month of November, starting off with Father Luca Illich, Rosetta Ellen, check out her YouTube channel, the name Eagle Rider. Miss Martin Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name. Matt317, check out his Twitch channel. Laura, the Mother Major General Story, sorry I didn't have enough spirit fingers there. Mr. Roy and ZK Man, who can check out over at xtheboundaries.co. If you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, check out the top link in the video description below. You get access to things like the giveaways channel, a podcast that I try to do every single month with a bunch of other awesome YouTubers, and a plethora of other content. So go ahead and check that out if you want more. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.